everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Red and Blue. We're now just 20 days from the end of the 2020 presidential election. I say the end of the election because voting is already well underway. According to the U.S. Elections Project, more than 14 million people have cast ballots so far. That's 1/10 of the total 2016 turnout. In the key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida, early vote totals are already at 20% of 2016 levels. Polling areas during early voting have been marked by massive lines, stretching as long as 8 hours in Texas and Georgia. As of now, our CBS News Battleground tracker shows Democratic nominee Joe Biden leading in states totaling 279 electoral votes. That's just over the 270 needed to win. You can see how that breaks down on the map here, showing the president's standing in the Rust Belt has fallen after winning Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania in 2016. The two candidates campaigned in the region last night. Former Vice President Biden in the toss-up state of Ohio and President Trump in Pennsylvania, which leans Democratic. They used their stops to pitch themselves to senior voters. Though President Trump won the group in 2016, he's now trailing Biden by a wide margin.
Biden's agenda would be a catastrophe for seniors. Biden cares more about illegal aliens than he cares about your seniors.
So many lives have been lost unnecessarily because this president cares more about the stock market than he does about, well-being of seniors.
Coronavirus cases are back on the rise in dozens of states, compounded by more than 25 million seeking unemployment benefits. Yet Congress and the White House remain unable to deliver additional aid to the country. The administration has started up negotiations again after pulling out of the talks last week. As it stands now, the Senate, White House, and Congress's proposals look too far apart for a deal to be reached by the election. This comes against the backdrop of confirmation hearings for the president's third Supreme Court nominee. In just 4 years, if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, Mr. Trump will have appointed more justices to the bench than any president since Ronald Reagan. For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Ed O'Keefe, and Eugene Scott. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. She's in the battleground state of Florida. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent outside a Northern Virginia early voting site. And Eugene is a political reporter for the Washington Post. Welcome to you all. Caitlin, let me start with you. President Trump is campaigning on the slogan of promises made, promises kept. He appears on the verge of delivering on the promise of reshaping the federal judiciary. But his 2016 campaign also came with promises to build a wall along the entire southern border and to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. What is the status on those promises?
That's right. 4 years ago, build the wall and Mexico will pay for it was a chant line at Trump rallies. And now we know that Mexico is not paying for the wall. A court ruling just last week said that Trump can't divert military funding to support building a fence at the southern border. He's trying to do that before the election. When it comes to health care, the repeal of Obamacare was one of the first moves that this administration made, was unsuccessful, of course, as we know how that Senate vote went. And the president instead now trying to say that he has a better plan to replace health care, although he hasn't released that plan. And that just goes to show how much health care has become a driver for voters. We saw that in 2018. It was something that helped Democrats win back the majority in the House. And we're also seeing it talked about in some tough congressional races, Republicans talking about health care. So that shows kind of how this issue moves. On the issue of the Supreme Court, this has traditionally been a galvanizing issue for Republicans, but it remains to be seen whether it will still be if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed. We have seen, however, that this has started to become a galvanizing force among Democrats, raising record amounts of money, especially in key congressional races. I think what's interesting, though, is that the president president is campaigning for re-election. He would be running on promises made, promises kept. But when you listen to the messages that he says at his rallies, including one he had here in Florida a couple of days ago, it's very much a negative message against Joe Biden, against the other side, kind of issuing warnings about what the country would look like if Biden were elected. So as much as this president is trying to say that they're running on a promises made, promises kept message, it's very much a negative, kind of fear-driven campaign.
Well, Ed, Thursday was supposed to be the second debate between the two candidates, but after President Trump tested positive for COVID-19, the debate turned virtual and he backed out. Instead, he's traveling to battleground states to host rallies for his supporters. How critical is that for the president, given his need to make up ground in the polls?
Well, in his view and in the view of his team, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. It's why he's doing it. If they felt that they could do this virtually, if they felt they could just do it with advertising, they would, but they can't. They understand that the physical presence of the president in these states has been and continues to be a galvanizing force, not only for supporters of the president, but just for Republicans generally. Remember, during 2018, in those midterm elections across the country, he showed up in the closing weeks of these contests where the Republican was just barely trailing the Democrat, or maybe it was just a little too close for comfort. The president would show up and boom, the Republican would jump ahead. We'll see if that happens for him. The fact that he's going to Iowa tonight, for example, is a great example of a complete fumble, so far at least, by the president's team. He shouldn't have to be in the Hawkeye state right now. This is one that they should have had put away. But given the way things are changing, given the fact that there is growing concern and disapproval with the president, his handling of the coronavirus, and the fact that that continues to dominate the headlines, he's got to go to Iowa to do some cleanup. And look at where Joe Biden has been in recent days. Ohio. His wife was in Texas yesterday. They're spending time in places they didn't think they'd be able to spend time right now to try to possibly win places like Ohio, Texas. Maybe even we'll see him go to a few other places that weren't necessarily considered winnable at the beginning of this year or earlier this summer. So, it's all a sign that this race remains unsettled, it remains competitive in enough places where if the president loses them, it's pretty much lights out very early in the evening. But if he can keep it close, he may be able to eke out another win just like that narrow one that he got 4 years ago.
Eugene, following up on Ed's point there, when you look at the state of the race, the president often discounts the polling as incorrect, especially after 2016. Many forecasts predicted Hillary Clinton would win. But I want to show you this chart from the New York Times that shows that if polls were as wrong as they were 4 years ago, Joe Biden still walks away with 319 electoral votes. Now, we're going to have more on this later in the show. But, Eugene, how different do things actually look for the Trump campaign this time around?
They look quite different, especially when you look at some of the states that the president won last time, that he actually is not on track to win right now. There are voters who are backing Joe Biden who didn't support Trump last time because they believed in his Make America Great Again message, but because they had issues with Hillary Clinton. And the reality is that Biden doesn't have the unfavorability numbers that Hillary Clinton had, and that's working out in his favor. It's also important to remember that whenever President Trump or anyone who supports him points to how incorrect the polls were in 2016, the fact is that the polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would receive and win the popular vote, which she did. And so is Joe Biden at a higher rate right now than President Trump is, which is why we're seeing him hit the trail as hard as he currently is, because his primary strategy is to turn out his base. He believes that if he can get the people who have backed him most faithfully since 2016 to continue to support him, he can edge out a victory. The big challenge he's having is that Trump's base is actually smaller now than it was in 2016. There are fewer voters registered as Republican now than there were 4 years ago, and that has the potential to hurt the president.
Ed, let me ask you, it's interesting. We talked to Tim Phillips with Americans for Prosperity yesterday on Red and Blue. He's down in Georgia trying to help with Senator David Perdue's reelection. He acknowledged it's a tough slog right now for these down ballot races. And I'm wondering what your thought is on the impact President Trump, given his standing, is having on the party's fundraising efforts for Republicans and these down ballot races.
Well, he doesn't have the same draw as he once did, and he isn't necessarily one that a lot of these down-ballot candidates want to see sending out fundraising appeals for them necessarily. I mean, the fact that Lindsey Graham, for example, in South Carolina, has had to go on Fox News several times in the last 2 weeks and beg viewers for money is a sign that, there's real trouble for him and that maybe more traditional fundraising methods weren't working. The other thing to remember with this pandemic, not only was the president's entire ability to campaign scrapped, but so was the traditional Republican ability to hold large, glitzier in-person fundraising events. That was probably going to dominate most of the vice president's campaign schedule, for example. He could have gone to Georgia to hold a fundraiser for David Perdue, or to South Carolina for Lindsey Graham, or to a lot of Midwestern states and parts of the South for congressional candidates. But he can't do that because we can't hold these large events given the pandemic. So they're affected in so many different ways. And to Eugene's point about there being more or fewer Republican voters overall than there were 4 years ago, that's an especially acute issue in Georgia, for example, where I think since David Perdue became a senator back in 2014, Democrats have registered at least 2.4 million more voters in that time. That's a completely different universe for a politician to be running in if even half of those people show up to vote. It completely changes the metrics on what a successful turnout operation and victory looks like. So that's the kind of problem also, in addition to the fundraising, that a lot of these down ballot candidates are facing in places like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, and out west in Arizona and Colorado. That's why you're seeing so many of these Senate candidates especially struggle because, frankly, the universe has just changed in terms of who's voting since they first won their seat or were last reelected a few years ago.
Caitlin, I want to ask you about the pandemic here. Just last night, President Trump falsely claimed to be immune to COVID-19 after contracting it, saying the country had turned the corner on the pandemic. It's still very much an open question, this question of immunity. But has the administration's strategy changed at all, Caitlin, in the months since the pandemic started?
It hasn't, and actually this afternoon we learned that the president's son, Barron, tested positive for COVID as well. The fact that the president is now a statistic, part of the number of Americans who have tested positive for COVID-19 has not changed his approach. In fact, if you look at the way he campaigned here in Florida just a couple of days ago, he held a big rally, no social distancing, very little mask wearing, and the message that he wanted to portray is that the pandemic is not front and center, that it's behind us, that we're moving forward. And we know in polling that that's just not true, at least how voters are perceiving it. But it is really interesting talking to voters on the ground here in Florida, this critical battleground state, of course, that is always determined by a very, very slim margin. And if you look at the way that Biden is campaigning versus the way Trump is campaigning, the kinds of events are intended to send a clear message. So we saw that rally from Trump. Biden was here in the state last night. He held a drive-in movie theater type of rally where he was trying to talk to seniors and talking about the pandemic. When you talk to voters who are supporting Biden, they bring up coronavirus as a top issue, the president's handling of it, how it's affected their everyday lives. But when you talk to Trump supporters here, they say that the president has done all he could and they are ready to move on. We actually talked to a woman just this afternoon who was supporting Trump. She said that she didn't like his behavior, didn't like how he talks, but thought that the economy is top of mind for her and she wants things to reopen. And that's kind of something that we've been hearing from Trump voters. Biden supporters, however, have been telling us that the pandemic is everything in this election, that it's shaping their views, it's affected their life, and that's something that they will be voting on in the fall.
Eugene, let's talk about the fight over voting itself. All across the country, we are seeing Democrats trying to expand the right to vote and the types of ballots that are counted. while Republicans, including the Trump administration, have taken steps to try to limit voting through state orders and lawsuits. Can you talk to us about their respective philosophies?
Well, the primary philosophy behind the Democratic Party, and quite frankly, one that to some degree an argument can be made that the Republican Party understands as well, is that the more people vote, the better, because it benefits the left. When turnout is at higher levels, especially in states that have younger and more diverse populations, Democrats tend to win races. And so that strategy, or that reality, has shaped the strategy of both the Democratic Party and the GOP when it comes to making voting more accessible. We're seeing mail-in ballots and absentee ballots being turned in at rates higher than they ever have been before compared to previous elections. And we remember, if many people will remember, if they recall correctly, about a month ago, Donald Trump was very vocal in trying to criticize the process of mail-in ballots, suggesting that they could not be trusted and that people needed to vote in person. Well, we're seeing what happens when people vote in person in states like Georgia and Florida. People have posted videos and photos to social media showing that they have been waiting in line for hours because these state legislatures, which have been controlled by Republicans for years, have not made voting as accessible in neighborhoods that are primarily consisting of people of color and low-income voters. The thought behind that, at least according to critics of the GOP, is that the Republican Party does not want the voting process to be as easy for these individuals, because if it is, the Republican Party will lose. And so one of the things I think that is going to be very fascinating about this election is that if it continues to go the way that things are projected right now, Democrats could maintain control of the House and possibly win control of the Senate. That could lead to some significant changes in voting across the country, as Democrats will likely try to make voting easier than it currently is for many Americans.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Ed O'Keefe, and Eugene Scott, thank you all very much.